Hello, and welcome to the conversation section of the Pathologies of Solitude website. We are an interdisciplinary research project funded by the Wellcome Trust, and we look at the history of solitude from the late 17th century to the present day, mainly asking questions about how experiences of solitude have changed over the centuries. And today I'm joined by Sophie Burrows, an award-winning writer, illustrator, and comics creator. She won the Student Illustrator of the Year award in 2019 at the V&A Illustration Awards for her graphic novel Crushing, due to be published in November, which is very exciting. And her first picture book, Ick Pig and Og Frog, was released in 2020. So thanks so much for joining us today, Sophie.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So we've had the absolute joy of working with you for over the past year, which I think has been such a great way for us to punctuate the pandemic. So I thought we'd start our conversation today by mainly just talking about your work up to the present day at the minute. So your absolutely beautiful work, Crushing, deals with themes of loneliness and connections. And I know that you've mentioned before that your work more broadly is inspired by the everyday. And I wondered whether you could tell us a bit about your work to date and those connections to loneliness that you had before you came to work with us.
So my work to date, I suppose I went to study illustration first in Bristol in 2008, I think it was, and I mainly worked as a children's book illustrator after I graduated. And my work wasn't really about loneliness then, I suppose. I was sort of just illustrating other people's stories, but then I went back to study an MA in children's book illustration in 2016, and I began writing my own stories then, and that's when I think sort of the autobiographical element fed into my work, and I began thinking about, I suppose, observations and things that were happening in my life and things that were happening around me and how that could influence my work, I think. And Crushing was something that I did in the second term of the MA. And it actually started as, it was supposed to be a love story. That was sort of what I was thinking about. But I think as the more I sort of began to unpick the parts of the story that I was interested in, I was thinking about cities and how we feel in cities. And I studied in London before I went to Bristol, just for a year. And I spent a lot of time on my own, and I was sort of on trains, and I was thinking about kind of glances that you have between people and ways that you kind of can be alone but with other people, I suppose, and connect in some way. So I think it all sort of started from that and just snowballed from there. And that's the first time that I was sort of discovering wordless sequences as well. And I think that they bring their own solitude because there are no words, so you're sort of alone with the illustrations, if that makes sense.
And that question of kind of being alone but together is something that we've kind of thought about quite a lot as a project. So I think kind of coming together with you and having those conversations about it kind of really brought some really interesting connections for us. In that, you know, we look at solitude historically, and I think we've found that often people in history find solitude quite difficult to define in language, which where you're talking about kind of wordless solitude and bringing that through images was really interesting for us, and how to translate kind of solitude as a concept visually. So I wondered whether you could talk a bit about how you found working with us as a research project, and kind of turning that into visual pieces.
I found it really hard, actually. It was interesting. It was a completely different process for me, and I hadn't anticipated how much of a jump it would be to kind of look at the academic research and begin to unpack that it was sort of a massive sidestep from the way I usually work, which is very autobiographical, like I said, and very kind of based on everyday and observations. And then you guys had all this amazing kind of historical research, and I absolutely adored reading it and talking to you all about it. And then it was sort of sitting there with it all. I remember I sort of sat with it all out in front of me, and I'd read it all, and I just thought, now where do I go? Because I think, I suppose it was just hard to sort of, some of it was so visually stimulating. I almost found that it didn't need illustrations, or I was wondering what I could bring to it, I suppose. And the way that I ended up figuring it out was, I think there was something, I wrote something down, there was something in your project outline, you wrote something about the poems as solitary spaces for inquiry. And I think that reading that, and maybe that sparked something within me, that I began to kind of think about, okay, I need to use this time as a space for inquiry through my own work. So thinking about questions really helped me. So rather than sort of trying to interpret all of the research that you've done, because I'm a massive overthinker, so I would sit there and overthink everything and try to sort of interpret it and translate it. And what I ended up doing was choosing parts of the research, or sort of sentences that spoke to me, and removed them, and then mulled on them for a little bit, and then thought about questions. So I had all these questions, and I did a mind map like this. Sort of thing is how I start a project. And once I started thinking about these questions and not trying to answer questions, because I didn't have the knowledge to answer the questions, that was sort of where the stories began to unravel. And then I was able to, once I was thinking about these questions, I was able to, I suppose, put my own autobiographical and observational parts back in then. So I was looking at people around me through the pandemic, and sort of how they were reacting to it, and that sort of thing.
Well, how about we turn to the 3 image sequences, and would you mind kind of talking us through them as kind of sequences, and potentially how each of them came about?
Yeah. Have a look. So the first one that I worked on was reverie, like I said. So the shower sequence, and initially that came from a number of different things in your research. I was sort of trying to find a way in, and ended up thinking about that autobiographical thing. So that was right in the middle of the pandemic, and I was thinking so much about I suppose the spaces that we are able to be alone, especially when everyone's in lockdown, and there aren't that many, for lots of people, there aren't that many places to be alone in your house besides the bathroom. So I thought initially I had to set something in there. And I think lots of my work has humor, and I was thinking bathroom humor, it should be something funny, but it didn't end up really being funny at all. I think once I began kind of thinking of these places, I was thinking about how I take my phone to the bathroom all the time, and am I really alone when I'm taking the phone to the bathroom? But when I was reading your research and listening to, I think you did an interview on CBC about Thomas Gray's poetry, and I was thinking so much about what you said. So all these feelings of separation from the natural systems and workings of the world, and it was so interesting because I think that in the pandemic we sort of forged these stronger relationships with nature, but then there was the new normal, and we were all on computers, and there was this battle of sort of just, I feel like many people's lives just became computers and then nature. and there was this to and fro, and there wasn't much in between. So I think I kind of wanted to explore that, and in that sequence, I was hoping to get this character in some way back in sync with that nature, so she could kind of connect to the workings of the world in some way, even if that was just in the shower and it was mimicking the rain, you know, rather than being truly connected to it. So those are the sorts of things that I was thinking about in that sequence. Yeah, I think it's something that I suppose it's the sequence that I felt the strongest connection to in terms of the subject, because in the pandemic, I think I was, well, in the pandemic, in the lockdown, I spent a lot of time looking at this tree outside my window, and it was signaling the changing of seasons. You know, I'd see the blossom and I'd see the leaves fall, but I don't know about you, I feel like time slowed and did strange things during that time, and I felt that disconnect because I couldn't truly realize it was happening, if that makes sense. So yeah, breathing space was the second one that I worked on, and I hadn't intended necessarily for them to be all kind of connected as a group, I suppose. But when I started approaching this comic, I ended up thinking that they sort of had to become a three and sit together in some way. And this was mainly influenced by kind of ideas around solitude and health. So I was thinking a lot about how those are connected, and lots of the reading that I was doing and the conversations that we had were about that. And your research where you talk about the sadness of care, who was that? Was that Pope? I know, John Armstrong.
It's John Armstrong, yeah.
And this idea that solitude can be nourishing and harmful. And I think I loved that there was so much push and pull in all of your research with this sort of the duality of all these different ideas. You know, it can be something great and it can be not so. And I became so interested in that divide and sort of that line as to where that could be, or if there has to be a line at all. And something that kind of made me start drawing what I did was I was looking also at news reports and things about loneliness, because I was doing crushing as well at the time. And there was this quote of that loneliness is more dangerous than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, I think, or something. And I began to think about smoking, and I, as an ex-smoker, I used to use my cigarette breaks when I smoked as a sort of opportunity for a moment of solitude. And I began to think intensely about this because I thought, well, I don't have anything as a substitute for that now. And it's something that I really struggled with when I quit, was to sort of carve out that time to do absolutely nothing and not distract myself. And this again came from observation. Out of my window during the pandemic, I would see this lady who would I'd only ever see her when she came out for her cigarette breaks, and then she'd disappear back inside. And it sort of became a little people watching exercise, like when you walk to work and you meet people on the way and you see the same people. And that's something that I really missed as well, because you didn't have that routine. So I would sort of see her when I was drawing out my window. And I began to think about her, and you know, what the only time I saw her was when she was smoking. So, you know, what's going on the rest of the time. Yeah, so that's sort of what kind of inspired that one. And also, I mean, that duality there. Sorry, I'm just reading my notes, and I've written something here. The solitude had the power to be curative, but could easily give way to sickly musing. So again, from your research, thinking about that space, that kind of space that I had when I was smoking, also then quickly turned into just thinking about how bad it was that I was smoking. And that is what I ended up doing. And I think that solitude also has that. So I was sort of just exploring that, really. Yeah, I'm just thinking, what are the questions that I've got written down for this one? Do we find it hard to allow ourselves time to experience being alone without some kind of excuse or distraction? Yes, I think I answered that one.
Yeah.
With that, but maybe others don't, I don't know. And then the last sequence, Return, is the shortest in the sense that it's only 3 panels. And this one was interesting, and I found it really hard to write about and maybe speak about, because it was almost, I was sort of on a roll by that stage, and it was almost a response to the previous sequence, because like I said, it was inspired, the previous one was inspired by looking out of my window at somebody, and then I was getting inside my head a little bit and thinking, well, I'm kind of, I think when we look at other people who are alone, we project perhaps our own assumptions on their aloneness and solitude and how they are maybe feeling, or the experience that they're having, when really we don't know anything about, I didn't know anything about this lady. So I was sort of thinking about looking out of the window, and that is where this sequence, I suppose, originated from. I was thinking about our perceptions of each other's solitude, and whether where on the spectrum, I suppose, of this nourishment and dangerous solitude that we would place other people's aloneness on. And so this nurse who I drew, and I think the nurse probably came as a physical embodiment of this sadness care, although I don't know if she is necessarily, but I was thinking about somebody who perhaps doesn't have much opportunity for solitude in this current situation, and I wondered about her. But again, to flip it again, I suppose, me as another outsider looking on this imaginary character, this is my perceptions again. I'm not a nurse. I don't know this person or how she experiences solitude. This is just kind of my concoction. So it was a lot about perceptions, this one, I think. I think some of the questions I was asking here were, for those of us who seldom find moments to be alone, what do we do with these moments when they come? The differences exist between a solitude that has been taken where we can get it, and one that is more deliberate. And is solitude a luxury? And I suppose this one is quite hard to talk about, because I'm not sure that I necessarily investigated it. There's more questions in this sequence than the others. But yeah, I think when I feel like I could have kept going and responded to them all in different ways, because once I'd done 3, they were in a neighborhood, I suppose. All these stories take place in the same area, maybe in the same block of flats. And I think once I'd started kind of world building, I was thinking, well, what other questions can I explore? But that's as far as I got.
Yeah, don't we all, really? Especially on this project, there are always more questions and more things to add to each of our projects, and we just have to say stop at some point. It's just so wonderful to hear you talk about each of the sequences, because it really speaks to kind of my personal experience of kind of seeing them come to life from all of our talks about the history of solitude. And I think it really reflects how, for our project, and especially for me, kind of dealing with 18th century questions of solitude, sometimes I can get slightly disconnected from it and think, what's sometimes what's the point of studying these 18th century poems? But actually the questions that they ask and the images that they create, I found especially over the pandemic, have shown that they still kind of resonate today with contemporary experiences. And it was so interesting to see them come to light in your work in kind of such a contemporary city setting. And just hearing you talk about them as a neighborhood is so interesting, because they're so, I think you can see when you see all three together, kind of the weaving between each. You know, for me, I kind of noticed the trails of the smoke kind of mimic the trails from the kettle, and it's just such a lovely kind of intricate connection between the three. And I wondered whether we could quickly just turn to the sketchbook, which from purely selfish reasons was just a joy to watch kind of come into our group Dropbox, because I did an art foundation before turning to English literature, so it kind of combined my two big joys of drawing and research, and kind of seeing all of your experiments with the different colors and the different line types was so interesting. And I wondered whether you could talk a bit about how, if we're thinking about the three as a neighborhood, I think each have their own quite distinct color palettes. And I wondered whether you could kind of talk about those palettes, how they came about and how they interlink.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, by the way. I love looking at other people's sketchbooks so much. I always think mine are a mess, but it's just so nice to see kind of the inner workings of things. I think that with this one, it's interesting because I ended up, I tried so many different ways of working, and I wanted to find the right fit, I think, in terms of materials for the project. And in the end, I settled on the one I did in terms of pencil, because it was really important to me to get across a clarity of ideas. And I think I wanted the illustrations to be clear. I wanted there to be ambiguity in perhaps how you read it, but not necessarily in in what something is. And I think with some of the materials I was playing with, the inks and things, it was maybe less clear. And with color, it was a really interesting one. I developed Reverie, the first sequence, I think perhaps while the others were still sketches, and I hadn't necessarily thought about so much about color. I knew I wanted to do a limited palette, and I chose blue because it was I suppose the color that made me think most about the subjects, you know, water, and blue is a sad color, and is she sad, perhaps? But as I laid it down and then started working on the next one, and it was unusual. I think it was unusual for me to go completely different with the colors, because if I want to connect them all, I would usually do that by color. But it felt right to use a completely different color palette. And as soon as I started working on the second sequence, I began thinking about light and time. And it was something that I wasn't aware that I had done, but when I looked back onto Reverie, I saw the the light coming through the window, and I began thinking about, I suppose, not only places that we find solitude, but the times in which we find solitude. And I wanted that to be really important in the sequences. And so that's sort of signaling the change of colors, and especially in Return, the last comic, I'm not 100% sure what time of day do you think it is?
Like early evening.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I had in mind, but I wasn't sure if it could have that similar light if it was perhaps really early in the morning. But I sort of wanted to do these different times of the day to to really think about different people and the times in which they have these spaces to be on their own. And you can't really tell what time of day it is in the first comic, but I quite like that on reflection, because I think it's that sort of time when if it gets really dark and rainy, like we've had very recently, and you have no idea what time of day it is, because it's sort of this darkness descends upon your house. And so I was sort of thinking about that in terms of completely cloaking the time, which worked out really well. So those are sort of the ways that I approach colour, and it was really interesting. It definitely developed my process, because it's not something that I had necessarily thought about before in my work and kind of explored. So it was really nice to have that opportunity to do that.
I think it works incredibly successfully.
Thank you.
So another aspect of your sketchbook that I thought was really interesting, I think it goes back to something you mentioned before about kind of most of your pieces being wordless and the solitude that brings about. Kind of through the sketches, there's pops of onomatopoeic sounds, like the tip taps of the keyboards and kind of inner thoughts. And I just wondered kind of their appearance in the sketchbook and their disappearance again in the final pieces, whether that was a process of whether you thought about including kind of text or speech or not.
Do you know, not necessarily. It's funny because my sketchbooks are full of writing. For someone that doesn't use many words in their artwork, I do a lot of working out through writing, and lots of my sketchbook pages will have these little notes. The tippy tap of the keyboards was another lockdown situation of when the pandemic first started. My partner started working from home and he didn't have a desk, so he was sharing my desk, and his typing vibrated the desk. So I was thinking intensely about solitude and dreaming about solitude in a desk that didn't have a tippy tappy keyboard upon it. But I think so much of it has to happen through writing, but then I try to find a way to visualize these thoughts, I suppose. I think I get a lot of inspiration from film, mostly, and I sort of think about those moments in film where they can tell so much without any dialogue and without any words. So that's sort of, I suppose, what the notes are. I'm not sure that. I wonder if it would have been nice to have some words, but perhaps running alongside as a separate, perhaps not something that is directly occurring with the text, which might be a nice thing to perhaps pair some words with these sequences in the future and see if their meaning could be changed.
Yeah, maybe some 18th century poetry.
Yes. That's your next job.
So the kind of last point I wanted to touch upon, and I apologize because it's a very big question, is that, so obviously the pandemic has kind of affected everyone's relationships with solitude, but there's been kind of really long-standing historical connections between solitude and creative production, whether that's visually or in language. And I wondered whether you had like any overarching thoughts about kind of solitude and creativity and their links, but possibly more specifically whether that's changed for you as an artist through the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it has. It's something that I've been thinking about, actually. It's a tricky one, and I think it's something that is changing, I think, throughout different stages of my life and my career as well. But I think it's a bit of a mixed bag for me at the moment. I think definitely sort of through lockdown and hopefully almost out the other side, I always thought that I worked better in solitude, and I think being able to process all the different thoughts and create the artwork. But I realized that I've now started doing this thing where I need to process my ideas verbally. So it's similar to the writing the notes, except I will chew the ear off anyone who will listen, whether they're interested or not, to kind of, I suppose, think out loud. So in that sense, I feel like it's good to have somebody there. I should probably just get a dictaphone and talk to myself, to check that things are making sense, and to check that I suppose just speaking out loud. But I think that, and I think this has always been true, and maybe something that I've been missing, I suppose, because I've not technically been in solitude. My partner works from home now, so we've been working in the same room. And I think there's a special kind of thinking that happens when you're on your own and in solitude, and it's not always easy to find. I don't think it's a magical thing that you're alone so that then you will start being creative. But for me, definitely, I think it's a space, I suppose, and then you can start to process things that you don't have any of that background. Almost like a step away from reality, if that makes sense. It sounds bizarre, but removing yourself and allowing yourself to think really deeply about something. And I think that's been harder through the pandemic, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily just because of the physical presence of another person. I think that lots of it is being able to be alone from your thoughts as well, I suppose, and the anxiety and the constant news that the pandemic has brought, I think, is another reason why it's harder, I suppose. In terms of making things, actual marks coming out of my pencils, not too much of a change, because that's almost, that it sounds silly, but that part of it doesn't have the same weight. It's almost the bit that comes before that. So that part, not so much. I just need the physical space to spread out and do that. But the thinking, sure. I think the lines have become blurred as well, I guess, between work and home. And I think that the nature of drawing for lots of people, for me, and probably you're right for you, is that your brain has to be ticking over all of the time. To be able to suddenly have that moment at 11 p.m. while you're having a cup of tea or something, that something's clicked. But I think because these lines have become blurred, there's been more of a sense of trying to have work time and trying to have not work time for relaxing. So I've been distracting myself a lot, maybe reading or watching TV or anything that isn't drawing, which is difficult because I feel like it's a very fluid sort of, I need to be thinking all the time, but I also need to not be thinking. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. My friends and I talk a lot about you have to give your brain time to marinate when you're doing research and writing. Like, you have to turn off at some point and not feel guilty about it. Yeah. Which is, I think, possibly the hardest, of not then having that boundary between work and home.
Definitely. And I've become that person who analyzes everything that we watch on television. I'm very annoying. I'll guess the story because my brain is always on storytelling and scenes and setting, and it's definitely a balancing act to switch off. So
Right, well, thank you so much for your time today, Sophie, and for all of the conversations we've had over the past year. I'm so glad we could kind of bring it together so that everyone can kind of experience the really interesting points that we've been talking about over the past year while they ruminate and enjoy your illustrations that will be up on our website.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been amazing to work with you guys, and I hope that we can do more things in the future.
Me too.
Yay.